Blood tastes like old pennies and dirty asphalt. Most folks spit it out immediately, panicked by the sudden metallic warmth spreading across their teeth. Harlan just swallows it. It's a familiar vintage. He leans against the shattered pie case, breathing in the cheap cologne of boys who just made a fatal mistake. Grease never truly washes off. It just settles deeper into the creases of your knuckles, hiding under the cuticles, becoming part of your skin. Harlan stared at his thick, scarred fingers gripping the edge of the metal spatula. He pressed the heavy iron down on a slab of bacon, listening to the sharp, violent hiss of fat rendering against the flat-top griddle. The smell was suffocatingly familiar, a heavy, suffocating blanket of cured pork, onions, and the sharp, chemical tang of the bleach he used to wipe down the counters at dawn. His diner, simply painted with the words Harlan's on a fading wooden sign outside, was an island of formica and cracked vinyl on a forgotten stretch of a Nevada secondary highway. It wasn't a place people sought out. It was a place people ended up when their fuel gauges dipped too low or when the glare of the interstate gave them a migraine. The bell above the glass door didn't jingle. It clanked, a dull, heavy sound like a dropped wrench. Harlan didn't turn around immediately. He moved the eggs around with the corner of his spatula. His lower back radiated a dull, constant ache. It was raining outside, a thin, miserable drizzle that dragged the smell of wet dust and diesel exhaust into the room whenever the door opened. 3 pairs of boots hit the linoleum. They weren't work boots. They were pristine, expensive sneakers that squeaked obnoxiously against the damp floor. Harlan flipped the eggs, finally casting a glance over his thick shoulder. They looked young, perhaps in their early 20s, carrying themselves with the exaggerated, wide-shouldered swagger of boys who had seen too many mob movies but had never actually been punched in the mouth. The one in the lead, wearing a puffy nylon jacket that rustled loudly with every movement, ran a hand over the burn marks on the front counter. His name, Harlan would later learn, was Corey. The other 2 flanked him, trying to look bored, chewing gum with open mouths. The diner was mostly empty. Just Boyd, a long-haul trucker, nursing a black coffee in the corner booth, and a tired-looking woman reading a paperback near the restrooms. Corey slapped his palm flat against the counter. The sound was loud, sharp, designed to startle. "Smells like a grease fire waiting to happen, old man." Harlan slowly wiped his hands on his stained white apron. He didn't speak. He just looked at Corey. Harlan's face was a map of bad decisions and hard miles deep lines carved around his eyes, a nose that had been broken at least 3 times and hadn't set quite straight, and a thick, graying beard that hid the worst of the scarring along his jawline. His eyes, pale and watery blue, held absolutely nothing. No fear, no anger, just a profound, heavy exhaustion. "You deaf?" the kid on Corey's left asked, leaning in. He smelled overwhelmingly of Axe body spray and stale weed. It cut right through the comforting scent of the coffee. "I hear fine," Harlan said. His voice was gravelly, low, sounding like it had to push past years of inhaled highway dust to get out. He reached under the counter, grabbing a damp rag. "Coffee?" Corey smirked, looking back at his friends. "Coffee? Sure. Pour us some coffee, Pops." They slid into the booths nearest the register. They didn't sit normally. They sprawled, taking up as much physical space as possible, draping their arms over the backs of the red vinyl seats. Harlan poured 3 mugs. The glass pot was heavy, and a sharp twinge of arthritis shot up his wrist. He ignored it. He set the thick ceramic mugs down. Black. No saucers. Corey didn't touch his mug. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, this is a nice little setup you got here. Quiet. Out of the way. But things happen out here in the sticks, right? Windows break. Fires start. Vandals." Harlan began wiping the counter down again, tracing slow, methodical circles over the faded laminate. He had heard this speech before, decades ago. Different state, different men, but the cadence was always exactly the same. The artificial concern masking the pathetic grab for dominance. "I don't have trouble," Harlan said quietly. "Everybody has trouble eventually," Corey countered, his voice dropping an octave, trying to sound menacing. "We represent a sort of neighborhood watch. We make sure places like this stay safe. For a small community contribution, of course." Harlan stopped wiping. He looked down at the rag in his hands. It was gray and frayed at the edges. He felt a familiar, dark flutter in his chest. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was memory. A physical sensation of adrenaline that his 68-year-old heart didn't want to pump anymore. He had spent 15 years burying a specific part of himself under layers of biscuit flour and fry grease. He didn't want to dig it up. Digging it up meant blood. Digging it up meant noise. "I don't need insurance," Harlan said. He turned his back to them and walked back to the griddle. "Hey," Corey's voice cracked, slightly betraying his youth. "I wasn't asking, Grandpa. I'm telling you." Harlan scraped the leftover grease into the trap. The metal scraped against metal, a harsh, grating sound. He felt the tension in the room thicken, changing the air pressure. The thugs were realizing that their script wasn't working. The old man wasn't cowering. He wasn't opening the register. He was just doing his job. And to boys like Corey, indifference was a far greater insult than defiance. Patience is a virtue rarely found in men wearing puffy jackets indoors. Corey stood up. The squeak of his expensive sneakers on the linoleum sounded violently out of place in the diner's quiet hum. He walked over to the counter, grabbing the heavy glass sugar dispenser. Harlan watched him out of the corner of his eye. His breath slowed. The dull ache in his lower back vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. It was a biological response, a survival mechanism honed over decades of riding with men who communicated primarily through blunt force. Corey turned the sugar dispenser upside down. The white crystals poured out onto the floor, a soft, hissing cascade that piled up like snow on the dirty tile. "Maybe you didn't hear me," Corey sneered. "We're your new partners." Boyd, the trucker in the corner, stood up. He was a big man, but soft around the middle, wearing a flannel shirt and suspenders. "Hey, leave the old guy alone. He said he ain't interested." The thug who smelled like cheap weed turned, stepping quickly toward Boyd. He shoved the trucker hard in the chest. Boyd stumbled backward, his heavy boots catching on the leg of his table. He went down hard, his elbow slamming into the floor with a dull thud. The woman reading the paperback let out a short, sharp scream and bolted for the front door, the bell clanking violently as she fled into the rain. Harlan didn't think. The time for thinking had ended the moment Boyd hit the floor. He didn't leap over the counter. He didn't execute a flawless martial arts maneuver. He was old, his knees were essentially chalk, and his left shoulder had a torn rotator cuff that flared up when it rained. Instead, he simply reached for the heavy ceramic coffee mug sitting on the counter, the one Corey had ignored, and swung it in a short, brutal arc as Corey turned his head. The mug connected with the bridge of Corey's nose. The sound was sickening, a wet, hollow crunch of collapsing cartilage and shattering ceramic. Coffee, scalding hot and black, exploded across Corey's face and jacket. Corey screamed, a high, reedy sound of absolute shock and agony. He stumbled backward, his hands flying to his face, blood instantly welling between his fingers, thick and dark. The other two froze for a fraction of a second. They hadn't expected the old man to fight back, let alone with such immediate pragmatic violence. But the hesitation didn't last. Adrenaline and embarrassment took over. The weed-smelling kid lunged across the counter. Harlan tried to pivot, bringing his left arm up to block, but his old muscles betrayed him. He was too slow. A fist caught him hard on the cheekbone. The impact sent a flash of white light across his vision. He staggered backward, his boots slipping on the greasy floor mats. Before he could catch his balance, the third thug vaulted the counter. A boot slammed into Harlan's ribs. He heard the distinct, sickening pop of bone giving way. The breath exploded from his lungs in a ragged, wet wheeze. He collapsed heavily against the stainless steel prep table, knocking over a tray of silverware. Knives and forks clattered onto the floor like a sudden metallic rain. They didn't stop. They swarmed him. Harlan curled inward, tucking his chin to his chest, protecting his head with his forearms. He felt a heavy kick to his thigh, another to his shoulder. He couldn't fight back against three of them. Not anymore. He was drowning in a sea of fists and boots, his own body feeling distant and numb. He tasted blood, thick, metallic, and warm. He swallowed it. Above him, he heard the sound of destruction. They were tearing his life apart to soothe their bruised egos. He heard the heavy crash as the pie case was shoved off the counter, the glass shattering into 1,000 crystalline fragments. He heard the squeal of the cash register being ripped open, the satisfying jingle of coins spilling across the floor. He heard the violent hiss of steam as one of them took a baseball bat where had they gotten a bat, to the espresso machine, snapping the pressurized water line. Hot water sprayed across the kitchen, filling the air with a damp, scalding mist. "You crazy old bastard!" Corey was screaming, his voice muffled by the blood pouring from his nose. "Smash it! Smash everything!" Harlan lay on the floor, his cheek pressed against the cold, damp tile. He opened one eye. Through a haze of pain and steam, he saw a dead moth lying near the floor drain, its powdery wings stuck to the wet grime. He focused on it. He focused on breathing. In, out. Sharp pain stabbed through his side with every inhalation. He wasn't angry. He was just incredibly, overwhelmingly tired. Finally, the noise stopped. The heavy, ragged breathing of the boys echoed in the steam-filled kitchen. "Let's go. Leave him. Let him rot," Corey spat. Footsteps crunched over broken glass. The front door opened, the bell giving one last mournful clank. Then, nothing but the hiss of the broken water line and the steady, depressing drum of rain against the shattered front window. Silence in a ruined room always feels heavier than it should. It presses down on your eardrums, punctuated only by the irregular drip of fluids finding the floor. Harlan didn't move for a long time. He just lay there, listening to the water pool around his boots. The diner smelled different now. The comforting scents of bacon and coffee were gone, replaced by the sharp odor of ozone from a sparking wire, the wet cardboard smell of ruined boxes, and the coppery tang of his own blood. He slowly rolled onto his hands and knees. The pain in his ribs was breathtaking, a jagged knife twisting with every millimeter of movement. He gritted his teeth, a low animal groan escaping his throat. He reached up, grabbing the edge of the prep table, and hauled himself to his feet. His legs trembled. His left eye was already swelling shut, the skin feeling tight and hot. He looked around. The diner was a carcass. The stools were overturned, their vinyl seats slashed. The glass from the pie case glittered maliciously under the flickering fluorescent lights. The register hung open like a broken jaw, a few stray dollar bills soaking in a puddle of spilled syrup. Boyd was gone. The trucker had likely slipped out the back the moment the fight started. Harlan didn't blame him. Survival was a solitary business. Harlan dragged a rag off the counter and pressed it against his split lip. He didn't reach for a broom. He didn't walk toward the phone behind the counter to call the police. The police asked questions. The police ran names. Harlan's name, his real name, the one tied to a social security number he hadn't used in 2 decades, was best left unrun. He limped toward the back of the kitchen. There was a heavy wooden door that led to his small office, a room that served as a bedroom on nights he was too tired to drive back to his trailer. The door was locked. He fumbled for his keys, his hands shaking slightly from the receding adrenaline drop. The lock clicked. He pushed the door open. The air in the office was stale. It smelled of old paperwork, damp cedar, and a faint, lingering trace of tobacco smoke from a pipe he hadn't smoked in years. The room was barely larger than a closet, containing a small cot, a battered metal desk, and a heavy, iron-bound footlocker shoved into the far corner. Harlan moved to the desk. He slumped into the chair, the springs groaning in protest. He let his head fall back, staring at the water stains on the ceiling tiles. He closed his eyes. He had wanted this to be over. He had walked away. He had paid his dues in blood, sweat, and prison time. He had traded the roar of a Harley panhead for the hiss of a griddle. He had traded brotherhood for solitude. He had built this quiet, pathetic little life so he wouldn't have to hurt anyone anymore. But the world, it seemed, wouldn't let a sleeping dog lie. If you play dead long enough, the vultures start circling. Harlan leaned forward, wincing as his ribs ground together. He looked at his hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. The vibration was internal. It was the engine turning over. The cold, dark thing inside him, the thing he had starved for 15 years, had tasted a drop of blood, and now it was awake. It was hungry. He pushed himself out of the chair and knelt beside the footlocker in the corner. The padlock was thick, rusted from years of neglect. He didn't have the key. He hadn't kept the key. He reached under the desk and pulled out a heavy pair of bolt cutters. It took 3 tries, his injured ribs screaming with the effort, before the hardened steel jaws bit through the rusty shackle with a sharp snap. He pulled the lock off and threw it aside. He opened the heavy lid. The smell hit him immediately. It bypassed his brain and went straight to his nervous system. Old motor oil, sun-baked dust, sweat, and heavy, stiff leather. He reached inside and pulled out the cut. It was a heavy denim vest, the sleeves hacked off decades ago, the fabric stained with grease, road grime, and darker, older things. But it was the back that held the weight. Sewn into the faded fabric was the large, imposing patch, the winged death head, the top rocker arched over it, spelling out the club's name in bold crimson letters, Hell's Angels. The bottom rocker held the territory, and a small, rectangular patch sat over the heart. Filthy few, a patch earned only by those who had done the darkest, most violent work for the club. Harlan ran his thick, calloused thumb over the heavy embroidery of the skull. The threads were frayed, but the colors were still vivid. He didn't put it on. He just held it in his lap, feeling the physical weight of his past pressing down on his thighs. He was Harlan the cook, the old man with the bad back. But he was also Harlan the enforcer, the man who had once cleared out entire bars with a sawed-off pool cue, the man whose name used to make rival club presidents lock their doors at night. He reached onto the desk and pulled an old black rotary phone toward him. The plastic was cracked, the dial stiff. He didn't need to look up a number. Some numbers are burned into your brain, right alongside the dates your friends died and the smell of your ex-wife's perfume. He stuck his thick index finger into the holes, the dial clicking heavily as it rotated and snapped back. It rang 3 times. A heavy, analog trill. Someone picked up. There was no greeting, just the sound of a television playing in the background and the heavy breathing of someone who had just woken up. Yeah. A rough, gravelly voice said. Harlan cleared his throat. He spit a glob of blood onto the floorboards. "It's Harlan," he said. His voice was steady now. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, terrifying calm. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The television in the background was muted. "Harlan," the voice said, the sleep entirely gone from it now. It held a mixture of deep respect and cautious surprise. "It's been a long goddamn time, brother. We thought you were a ghost." Harlan looked down at the leather vest in his lap. He traced the curve of the death head's wing. "I was," Harlan said quietly, staring at the blood drying under his fingernails. "But I need the boys to ride out. Somebody just woke me up." Vibrations reached the cracked linoleum long before the sound breached the diner's shattered windows. Harlan sat on a plastic milk crate behind the counter, a roll of silver duct tape resting on his knee. He had bound his torso tightly, wrapping the tape over a thick cotton towel to brace his broken ribs. Every breath was a shallow, measured negotiation with pain. He didn't look up as the low, guttural rumble of heavy V-twin engines began to bleed through the damp night air. It wasn't a roar, it was a physical pressure, a localized earthquake rolling down the desolate stretch of Nevada highway. Headlights, yellow and piercing, swept across the rain-slicked walls of the diner, illuminating the sparkling field of broken glass that covered the floor. The engines cut out, one by one, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in their wake. Then came the heavy crunch of boots on wet gravel. 5 men walked through the open frame of the front door. They didn't step carefully. Their heavy engineer boots crushed the remnants of Harlan's pie case into fine powder. They wore heavy denim and black leather, soaked completely through by the rain, smelling intensely of wet rawhide, exhaust fumes, and stale cigarette smoke. At the front of the pack stood Deacon. He had aged just as hard as Harlan, his face a map of deep ravines, his beard completely white and tied off with small rubber bands. He wore a heavy silver chain hooked to a worn leather wallet, and his cut hung open, revealing the faded ink covering his throat. Deacon stopped in the center of the wreckage, his dark eyes taking in the slashed vinyl, the busted espresso machine, and finally Harlan, sitting hunched on his milk crate in the shadows. "Place looks like shit, Harlan," Deacon said. His voice was a low, resonant rumble, scraping against the walls. "Remodeling," Harlan rasped, wiping a speck of dried blood from the corner of his mouth. He gripped the edge of the stainless steel prep table and pushed himself up. The room tilted for a fraction of a second before his vision stabilized. Deacon stepped closer. He looked at Harlan's face. the swollen, purple mass of his left eye, the unnatural stiffness in his posture. He didn't offer pity. Pity was an insult among men who had spent their lives trading in violence. Instead, Deacon reached into his heavy canvas jacket and pulled out a pint bottle of cheap rye whiskey. He unscrewed the cap with his teeth, spat it onto the floor, and handed the bottle to Harlan. Harlan took it. The glass was warm from Deacon's body heat. He took a long, burning pull. The liquor hit his throat like battery acid, settling into his stomach with a heavy, necessary warmth. He handed it back. 3 kids, Harlan said, his voice flat, stripped of any emotional inflection. One in a puffy blue jacket, squeaky shoes. Swung first, so I broke his nose with a coffee mug. They stomped me, trashed the register, broke the water lines, left 5 minutes before I called you. A younger man behind Deacon, wearing a fresh bottom rocker on his vest, let out a short, hollow laugh. Kids, tearing up a diner. They don't even know who they just stepped on. Deacon silenced the younger member with a sharp, backward glance. He turned his attention back to Harlan. You know where they went? They aren't locals, Harlan said, walking slowly toward the office door. Each step sent a white-hot spike up his side. But they've been around before. They buy their weed from a trailer park down near the old copper mine. Snot-nosed punks playing gangster. They'll be hiding out, celebrating the $50 they got from my till. Deacon nodded slowly. He looked around the ruined diner again, his jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. Get your gear. Tommy brought the truck. You're in no shape to straddle a panhead. Harlan didn't argue. Pride was a luxury he had discarded decades ago. He walked into the dim office and picked up the heavy leather vest from the desk. It felt alien in his hands, thick and unyielding. For 15 years, he had worn soft cotton aprons. He slipped his good arm through the armhole, wincing sharply as he contorted his bad shoulder to get the other side on. The moment the leather settled on his shoulders, the atmosphere in the room shifted. He wasn't Harlan the line cook anymore. The winged death head on his back carried a terrifying gravitational weight. He walked back into the kitchen area. The 5 men saw the patch. They saw the filthy few tag. The casual posture of the younger members instantly vanished, replaced by a rigid, solemn respect. They walked outside into the biting cold. The rain had slowed to a miserable drizzle. 5 Harleys sat in a staggered formation, their hot exhaust pipes ticking loudly as they cooled in the damp air. Behind them idled a beat-up, primer-black heavy-duty pickup truck. Tommy, a massive man with scars crisscrossing his bald scalp, sat behind the wheel, smoking a cigarette down to the filter. Harlan climbed into the passenger seat. The door closed with a heavy, metallic slam. Deacon straddled his bike, kicking it to life with a deafening roar that tore the quiet night in half. The others followed suit, the air filled with a thick, choking cloud of blue exhaust. "We check the mine first," Deacon yelled over the engines, pulling his goggles down. Harlan just nodded, staring out the cracked windshield of the truck. He felt the cold iron of a heavy tire iron sitting between the seats. He didn't pick it up. He just looked at it. His stomach churned, a sour mixture of cheap whiskey, swallowed blood, and a deep, profound dread. He didn't want to do this. He just wanted to fry bacon. He wanted to go back to the quiet anonymity of burnt coffee and dirty floor mats. But the rules he had sworn his life to, the ink burned into his skin, demanded a balance. Blood for blood, ruin for ruin. The convoy pulled onto the wet highway, a mechanical hunting party carving through the dark. The old copper mine hadn't seen a legitimate crew in 30 years. It was a rusted, skeletal ruin of corrugated tin buildings, decaying conveyor belts, and toxic tailings ponds. At the edge of the property sat a cluster of rotted single-wide trailers, a haven for meth cooks, squatters, and boys trying to play outlaw. Tommy killed the truck's headlights a quarter-mile out. The bikes did the same, rolling the last stretch entirely in the dark, navigating by the faint, gray moonlight bleeding through the cloud cover. The deep rumble of the engines dropped to a low, throaty whisper. They parked behind a mound of slag dirt. The air here smelled different, sharp, chemical, and heavily laced with the skunky odor of cheap marijuana. Through the cracked window of the largest trailer, a flickering orange light bled into the night, accompanied by the tinny, distorted bass of a rap song playing on a cheap Bluetooth speaker. Harlan stepped out of the truck. The cold mud sucked at his boots. He buttoned the top two brass snaps of his cut over his taped ribs. Deacon walked up beside him, unhooking a heavy, leather-wrapped sap from his belt. "3 of them," Harlan whispered, his breath pluming white in the freezing air. "The loudmouth with the broken nose is mine. The rest, just make sure they sit down." Deacon gave a single, curt nod. He signaled the others. They fanned out like shadows, their movements terrifyingly quiet for men of their size. 2 went to the back door of the trailer. Deacon and Tommy flanked the front. Harlan walked straight up the center, his boots crunching loudly on the crushed beer cans littering the yard. He didn't bother knocking. He didn't need the element of surprise. He needed them to feel the dread. Harlan kicked the flimsy aluminum door. The latch, already rusted and weak, tore out of the frame with a sharp screech of tearing metal. The door banged open, hitting the interior wall hard enough to shatter a framed mirror inside. The music stopped abruptly. The air inside the trailer was thick and suffocating, smelling of stale bong water, spilled beer, and unwashed bodies. Corey sat on a torn floral sofa in the center of the narrow room. He was holding a blood-soaked rag to his face, his eyes wide and bloodshot above the swelling ruin of his nose. The puffy blue jacket was off, discarded on the floor, stained dark brown with dried coffee and blood. His 2 friends, the one who smelled like weed and the one who had kicked Harlan's ribs, froze near a dirty kitchenette, clutching half-empty beer bottles. "What the hell?" Corey mumbled, his voice thick and nasal, unable to breathe through his shattered cartilage. He squinted against the darkness of the doorway. Harlan stepped into the weak, flickering light of a single floor lamp. The heavy leather of his vest creaked. The kid by the kitchenette squinted, his eyes tracking over Harlan's bruised face, then dropping to the patches on the leather, the crimson letters, the winged skull. The color completely vanished from the boy's face, leaving him a sickening, chalky gray. The beer bottle slipped from his fingers, shattering on the linoleum floor. The sharp crash was the only sound in the room. "Oh, Jesus," the kid whispered, backing up until his shoulders hit the cheap wood paneling of the wall. Corey didn't understand. He was too blinded by the pain in his face and his own inflated ego. "You crazy old bastard," Corey spat, trying to stand up, his legs shaky. "You followed us? I'll kill you. I swear to God. He didn't finish the sentence. Deacon stepped out of the shadows behind Harlan, pulling a massive, heavy-barreled revolver from his waistband. He didn't point it at anyone. He just let it hang loosely at his side. Tommy squeezed through the doorframe next, his sheer bulk blocking the only exit. From the back of the trailer, the other 2 club members kicked open the rear door, stepping into the kitchen and pinning the other 2 boys in place. The realization hit Corey like a physical blow. His eyes darted from the patches to the guns, to the cold, dead eyes of the men filling his living room. His tough guy facade evaporated instantly, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, trembling child. His knees buckled, and he sank back onto the sofa, the bloody rag slipping from his fingers. "You broke my pie case," Harlan said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence with surgical precision. Harlan walked forward. Every step was agony, but he didn't let it show on his face. He stopped directly in front of Corey. The boy was shaking violently now, his chest heaving, tears mixing with the crusted blood on his cheeks. "Look at me," Harlan demanded, his tone hollow. Corey looked up, whimpering. "Man, please. We didn't know. We didn't know who you were. It was just a joke, a stupid joke. Take the money back. Take it all." He pointed a trembling, frantic finger at a crumpled pile of small bills on a coffee table. "I don't care about the money," Harlan said. He looked down at the boy. He felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a profound, crushing emptiness. This was what he had run away from. This pathetic begging, the smell of urine as the kid by the kitchen wet himself in terror, the inevitable violence that solved nothing but only delayed the next conflict. Harlan slowly reached out and grabbed Corey by the front of his shirt, hauling him to his feet. Corey sobbed out loud, a pathetic, high-pitched wail. "You talk about neighborhood watch," Harlan whispered, pulling Corey's face inches from his own. Harlan's breath was hot, smelling of whiskey and old blood. "You talk about protecting people. You're a parasite." You bleed people who actually build things. Harlan didn't punch him. His ribs wouldn't take the torque, and hitting a crying boy felt entirely devoid of honor. Instead, Harlan grabbed Corey's right hand, the one he had used to shove the heavy glass sugar dispenser. With a sudden violent twist, Harlan bent Corey's wrist backward, pinning the boy's forearm against the edge of the coffee table. Corey screamed, a raw, ragged sound of sheer panic. "Don't ever," Harlan said, his voice dropping to a demonic rumble, "come into my diner again." Harlan brought his heavy work boot down on the center of Corey's pinned hand. The sound was terrible. A sickening, wet crunch of small bones, snapping like dry twigs under a heavy tire. Corey's scream shattered, turning into a breathless, gagging shriek as he collapsed onto the floor, curling into a tight, fetal ball, clutching his mangled hand to his chest. The other two boys screamed, begging the men holding them not to hurt them, babbling apologies and desperate promises. Deacon stepped forward, slamming the butt of his revolver hard into the stomach of the weed-smelling kid, folding him in half. "Get out of this county," Deacon growled to the gasping boys. "If any of you are within 200 miles of that diner by sunrise, we won't just break your hands, we'll bury you under the slag. Nod, if you understand." The boys nodded frantically, weeping, unable to speak. Harlan didn't look at them. He turned his back on the pathetic scene and walked out the shattered front door, stepping back into the freezing mud. The cold air hit his face, stinging the swollen flesh around his eye. He walked over to the pickup truck and leaned heavily against the rusted quarter panel. He closed his eyes, drawing in a long, shaky breath, letting the pain in his ribs flare up and ground him in reality. A few minutes later, Deacon and the others emerged from the trailer. They didn't speak. They mounted their bikes. Deacon walked over to Harlan. He leaned against the truck, pulling a pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He offered one to Harlan. Harlan shook his head. "You did what you had to do, brother," Deacon said quietly, lighting his cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating the deep creases around his eyes. "You let a wolf bite you and you do nothing, the whole pack comes tomorrow. That's the law. You know that." "I know," Harlan rasped. He looked at his hands. They were trembling again, not from adrenaline, from disgust. "But it doesn't mean I have to like the taste of it anymore." Deacon blew a long stream of smoke into the damp air. "You want to ride back with us? Stay at the clubhouse tonight? Got a couch that's softer than that cot you sleep on." Harlan looked out toward the dark horizon, toward the highway that led back to his diner, his ruined, shattered little sanctuary. "No," Harlan said, pulling the heavy leather cut off his shoulders, grimacing as his torn muscle protested. He folded the vest carefully over his good arm. "I've got a mess to clean up." "Breakfast rush starts at 6. Deacon stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. He reached out, clasping Harlan on the shoulder, a heavy, brotherly grip that spoke of shared wars and silent understandings. "You need anything? You call the number. It doesn't change." "Yeah," Harlan whispered. He climbed back into the passenger seat of the truck. Tommy put the vehicle in gear, the heavy tires spitting mud as they pulled away from the trailer park, leaving the screaming boys behind in the dark. An hour later, Harlan stood alone in the center of his diner. The club had dropped him off and ridden out, their engines fading into the distance, taking the storm with them. The silence was back, heavy and absolute, broken only by the steady drip of the leaking espresso machine. He walked into the back office. The heavy iron footlocker sat in the corner, its lid open, waiting. Harlan laid the leather cut back inside. It smelled of wet rain and trailer park dirt now, adding another layer to its history. He closed the heavy iron lid. The padlock was broken, shattered by his own bolt cutters. He picked up the two broken pieces of the lock and set them on top of the lid. He couldn't lock it away anymore. The box was open. The ghost was out. He turned off the light in the office and walked back out into the wreckage of the kitchen. His ribs ached with a dull, throbbing rhythm, keeping time with his exhausted heart. He picked up a heavy bristled push broom from the corner. Slowly, painfully, Harlan began to sweep the broken glass. The sharp, grating sound of ceramic and glass scraping against the linoleum echoed through the empty diner. It was a harsh, lonely sound. But as he swept the debris into a neat, manageable pile, smelling the faint, lingering scent of burnt coffee and grease, he found a small, pathetic sliver of peace. He was Harlan the cook again. But he knew, and the dark highway outside knew, that the old man with the bad back was just a very quiet disguise. If you felt the grit and tension in Harlan's story, hit that like button and subscribe for more raw, grounded storytelling. Who do you think will regret this more? The thugs or Harlan for waking his past? Let us know in the comments below and share this video with anyone who loves a gritty tale of slow burn revenge. Stay tuned for the next chapter. You won't want to miss what happens when the rumble finally arrives.